He never saw it coming. 1 second, he was drifting in and out of a shallow sleep under the soft sway of tree branches above. The next, agony. A white-hot bolt of electricity tore through his ribs, stealing the air from his lungs and every thought from his mind. His body twisted violently against the slats of the bench, a muffled, broken sound escaping his throat. It wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it came with a voice, sharp, mocking, and laced with disgust. "Get up, old man. This ain't a motel." The words cut deeper than the voltage. Dazed and gasping, Arthur Jenkins blinked through a fog of pain, his muscles still spasming from the shock. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting jagged shadows across the park path, but all he could focus on was the figure looming over him. A young man in a security uniform, mid-20s maybe, still gripping a taser like it was some kind of toy. The prongs, still smoking, hung from the wire like a cruel joke. A second guard leaned lazily against a nearby lamppost, arms folded, watching it all unfold with a smirk tugging at the edge of his mouth. Arthur tried to move, to sit up, but his side screamed in protest. His fingers clutched instinctively at the pain. His thoughts were scattered, too scattered to answer the questions that hadn't even been asked yet. Every part of him knew what had happened, but not why. He hadn't done anything. He wasn't causing trouble. He had simply closed his eyes, resting between appointments, carrying the weight of 70 years on joints that hadn't truly relaxed since his last deployment. And yet here he was, treated like a criminal for daring to stop and breathe. The first guard, Dave as his name tag read, stepped in closer, taser now hanging casually at his side. "You deaf or just playing stupid?" he barked, clearly enjoying the moment. Arthur opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Not yet. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, his breath ragged. He felt exposed, humiliated. For a moment, he wasn't in a park. He was back in the chaos of foreign lands, under fire, disoriented, bleeding. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was home, or at least it used to be. Arthur Jenkins had served 3 decades in uniform. He'd trained with the best, fought in places most Americans couldn't pronounce, seen brothers fall in his arms, and endured wounds that had never fully healed. His chest still bore the scar from a mortar blast in '93, and his back stiffened from a parachute landing gone wrong in desert terrain. Pain he could manage, he had learned to, but this was something different. The pain now didn't come from an enemy, it came from someone who should have known better, from someone who had never heard a bullet whistle past their ear. He was a man used to being invisible. His posture, despite age, still carried the ghost of command, his silence often mistaken for weakness. He didn't wear his medals, he didn't speak of his years with Task Force Omega. He carried his past like he carried his rucksack, quietly and with care. But this new wound wasn't physical, it was personal. It wasn't just about him. It was about every man and woman who had come home to a country that saluted their flag but walked past their pain. As Arthur finally managed to pull himself upright, breath coming in short huffs, he looked into the eyes of the guard. There was no apology there, no concern, just impatience. The other one, Mike, chuckled again, tapping his nightstick lightly against his palm. "Should have stayed awake, Grandpa. You scare the decent folks." Arthur's mouth was dry, his voice hoarse. He swallowed hard, trying to find something, anything to say that might pierce their indifference. "I wasn't doing anything," he said at last, the words barely louder than a whisper. "Just needed to sit, just needed to rest my eyes." He almost added, "I'm tired." But he didn't. It felt too raw, too exposed. The guards weren't listening anyway. They had already decided what he was, a nuisance, an eyesore, a vagrant, not a man with a name, a story, a sacrifice that had paved the very ground they now patrolled with mock authority. He could have told them that he'd seen more action than they'd seen traffic, that he'd carried fallen friends on his shoulders through smoke and shrapnel, but he didn't, because in that moment he knew they wouldn't hear it. Some people don't recognize honor unless it's wearing shiny boots and standing in formation, and Arthur's boots, like his body, were worn from years of quiet service. Dave stepped back and crossed his arms, staring at the park signage. "No loitering, no sleeping on benches," he quoted with exaggerated emphasis. "Plain English, old-timer. You're lucky I didn't call the cops." Arthur nodded slowly, lowering his eyes to the pavement. He wasn't ashamed. He was calculating. He knew when to speak and when to stay silent. Right now he just needed to get through this. One more battle, one more idiot with a badge, but deep inside something had shifted, because this wasn't going to be ignored, not this time. As Arthur reached for his rucksack, his hands trembled, not from fear, but from age, from injury, from the electrical aftermath of the taser still echoing through his muscles. The bag was old, the canvas faded, seams fraying slightly at the edges. It had been with him for years, through moves, appointments, long bus rides and longer waits in VA clinics. It held his life, what little of it he chose to carry. A folded change of clothes, a weathered Bible, a small tin of medication, and a few personal items wrapped carefully in cloth and memory. But as he fumbled with the zipper, fingers not as steady as they once were, the bag tipped. A few items spilled out onto the sidewalk. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just the quiet remnants of a quiet man's story. A dog-eared paperback landed spine down. A crumpled photograph fluttered to the pavement, 3 young men in dusty fatigues smiling beneath a tattered flag. And then came the sound, a sharp metallic clink, small but unmistakable. A coin, about 2 inches wide, rolled forward and came to rest with a dull tap against the toe of Dave's boot. He looked down, curiosity barely masking disdain. With a lazy flick of his foot, he nudged the object slightly, then bent down and scooped it up between 2 fingers like it was a dirty bottle cap. Holding it up to the light, he turned it over once, twice. "What's this supposed to be?" he sneered. "Some kind of military trinket? Carnival prize?" The coin was bronze, dense, with a detailed insignia engraved in its center, a stylized omega symbol coiled around a downward-pointing sword, circled by a laurel wreath. It looked old, and it didn't look like anything he understood. Arthur's eyes widened slightly. His hand lifted, palm out, as if to say, "Stop," to beg without words. "Please," he said, his voice rough but firm. "That coin is... it's important. Don't play with it." The tone wasn't angry. It wasn't desperate. It was reverent. But the guards weren't listening. Dave smirked and held it just out of reach, watching Arthur like a child taunting a dog with a treat. "This," he said, "this little piece of junk, looks like it came out of a souvenir shop." Mike leaned in, peering at the coin with mock interest. "Might be worth $1 or $2 on eBay," he chuckled. "Hell, maybe we should pawn it for a sandwich." The two of them laughed, a hollow sound that clashed sharply with the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby space. Because someone else had noticed. Someone standing not far from the bench, quietly watching. He was an older man, graying, glasses perched low on his nose, a retired schoolteacher by trade, and a lifelong student of military history by passion. His name was Walter Henderson. He had come to the park that day to enjoy the weather and feed the birds, nothing more. But when he saw the way the guards were treating the man on the bench, he had paused. And when he saw the coin, that coin, his pulse quickened. The insignia triggered something in his memory, not a headline or a book cover. Something buried deeper. A journal article he had read years ago, passed along by a former student who now worked in military intelligence. It had been about a covert unit, a classified operation no longer under strict lock, but still far from public knowledge. He couldn't recall the exact designation, but the symbol, that sword and omega, it was burned into his brain. His brow furrowed. He pulled out his phone. As the guards continued their mockery, Walter stepped aside and dialed. The call was quick, but his voice was urgent. "David? Yes, it's Henderson. I know it's been a while, but listen. I'm in City Park. I need you to check something for me. There's a man here, older, clearly ex-military, and the guards just pulled a coin from his bag. Bronze, omega symbol, sword through the middle, wreath around it. He mentioned something. Kalat. Kalat Sikar, I think." There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Yes," Walter said. "That's what I thought too. Task Force Omega. I thought it might be. Look, they're harassing him. They tased him. Right here in the open. This could be serious." He gave his location, quickly, quietly. "Near the fountain. I'll stay close. But if that coin is what I think it is, you need to move. Fast." Back at the bench, Arthur still hadn't moved. His eyes were locked on the coin, not in fear, but with something deeper. Loss, memory, duty. That coin wasn't just metal. It wasn't just symbolic. It was given to him by General Armitage himself, the kind of man whose name was only whispered in certain circles. It had been earned, not gifted. It wasn't about the metal. It was about what it represented, a mission that was never supposed to exist, a debt that had been paid in blood and silence. Dave, still holding the coin, rolled it across his knuckles in mock admiration. "So tell me, Grandpa," he said with a laugh, This little token, your secret decoder ring or something? What, the president give it to you for saving his lunch order? Arthur blinked slowly. That coin, he said, his voice now steady, measured, the tremble gone, was given to me by General Armitage for what happened at Kalat Sikar. He said the words like a password, a key. The laughter died. Walter Henderson, still on the call, froze. He just said it, he whispered. He just confirmed it. And somewhere, across a secure line, someone at the Pentagon stood up. The moment the words left Arthur's mouth, Kalat Sikar, something shifted in the air, not just for him or for the guards, but for the handful of onlookers whose casual interest had turned into something else entirely. A name like that didn't sound like the kind of place that showed up in travel brochures. It sounded like classified geography, the kind of word you might catch whispered in a Pentagon hallway or buried in the footnotes of a redacted document. And the man who had said it, he didn't flinch when he spoke. He didn't smile or bluff. He spoke the name the way a man speaks of a place carved into his bones, not read from a book. Dave was still holding the coin, but now it felt heavier in his hand. The laughter that had come so easily only seconds ago now caught in his throat. Mike looked over, the sneer slowly draining from his face. What did he say? He asked under his breath. Dave didn't answer. He was still staring at Arthur, trying to figure out if this was some act or if maybe, just maybe, they'd made a mistake far bigger than either of them could fix with a radio call. Walter Henderson had stepped back slightly, still gripping his phone tightly to his ear. His voice was hushed, deliberate. David, this is serious. He said Kalat Sikar, and he mentioned General Armitage by name. This isn't a coincidence. I know what that coin is now. I need confirmation, but I think we're standing in the middle of something a lot bigger than a loitering violation. On the other end of the line, Walter's former student had gone silent, then responded in a clipped tone. I'll notify the team. Stay where you are. Keep eyes on him. Help him if you can. The call ended. Walter didn't move. He just stood, watching. Arthur, still seated, looked down at his lap. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He had spoken the name, and that was enough. His silence now was the silence of someone who'd carried too many secrets for too long, the kind of man who never wanted attention, but understood that sometimes attention found you anyway. Mike, trying to regain his composure, scoffed weakly. So now you're some kind of war hero, huh? Is that it? Next you gonna tell us you know aliens too? His voice was brittle, all bark and no bite. Dave wasn't laughing anymore. He looked at Arthur, then at the coin, then at the small crowd that had started to grow around them. People were watching, filming. The mood had changed. He could feel it like a weight in the pit of his stomach. The old man wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening, wasn't crying. He just looked disappointed. And that somehow was worse. Then, just as Dave was about to pocket the coin, or maybe throw it away, a sound interrupted the building tension. It wasn't loud at first, but it was distinct. Low, deep, and growing fast. Not a siren, not a distant horn. It was something heavier, a controlled rumble that made the pavement feel alive beneath their feet. The kind of sound that doesn't announce itself with drama, but with authority. Heads turned, conversations stopped. From the park's main road, flanked by confused civilians and slowing traffic, 3 black SUVs appeared, sleek, identical, windows tinted darker than regulation. Their motion was smooth, practiced, cars that didn't meander or hesitate. They moved like they had somewhere to be and didn't need permission to get there. They didn't drive past the park. They turned into it. Gravel crunched beneath their tires as the lead vehicle pulled up just a few yards from the bench. Doors opened with mechanical precision, no flashing lights, no shouting, just presence. From each SUV, men and women in dark, sharply tailored suits emerged, not bulky, not showy, but alert. Their eyes scanned the area, heads on a swivel, posture coiled with readiness. They didn't move like rent-a-cops. They moved like people trained to spot a threat before it knew it was one. One figure stepped forward ahead of the rest. Older, tall, a firm, controlled gait, hair cropped short and silver at the temples. His suit wasn't flashier than the others, but the way he walked made it instantly clear he was the one in charge. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't even glance at the 2 guards. His eyes went straight to Arthur Jenkins. He stopped in front of him, studied his face for a beat, and then spoke a name like it was a sacred thing. Sergeant Major Jenkins. Arthur looked up slowly. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Then recognition, then something quieter, deeper. Resignation. General Wallace, he said, and though his voice was soft, it carried. Sir. Wallace exhaled slowly, like a man confirming a hope he hadn't dared believe. It's really you." Now the crowd really started to murmur. Phones were up. People began whispering. "General," someone said. "What's going on?" But Wallace didn't turn to address them. He was locked onto Arthur. Dave, still clutching the coin, stepped forward, puffing himself up. "Excuse me, sir, this is a private security issue. We have it under control." Wallace didn't even blink. He didn't acknowledge Dave's existence. It was as if the young guard hadn't spoken at all. He simply extended a gloved hand toward the coin, palm open, fingers still. Dave hesitated, suddenly unsure of everything. His mouth opened, then closed. Slowly, reluctantly, he placed the coin into Wallace's hand. Wallace looked down at it, his jaw tensed. Then he looked back at Arthur, and the steel in his eyes was unmistakable. "This coin," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "was awarded to Task Force Omega operatives for extraordinary valor. Khalat Sikar was one of the bloodiest shadow conflicts in modern warfare. It was never meant to make headlines. The people who were there never expected glory, but they saved lives. They turned the tide of something that was supposed to be hopeless, and this man," he motioned to Arthur, "was at the center of it." Silence settled over the park like a blanket. Even the wind seemed to pause. Wallace's voice dropped into something lower, more intimate. "You saved my life, Sergeant Major. I was just a captain then. But I remember every hour of those 3 days, and I remember who got us out." He turned toward the crowd now, his gaze sweeping the faces. "You call him homeless, a vagrant. You tased him while he slept. But let me be perfectly clear, this man is a hero of the highest order." And just like that, the power in the park shifted. Authority didn't lie with badges anymore. It didn't lie with uniforms or rules posted on signs. It stood quietly on a worn patch of gravel in the form of a man whose greatest deeds had been carried in silence, until now. Wallace still held the coin in his hand, but now it was more than an object. It was a symbol, a turning point. His thumb moved over the surface, tracing the edge of the Omega insignia, and in that simple motion there was something reverent, something almost sacred. Then he turned his gaze to the 2 security guards standing awkwardly to the side. Dave, still flushed and stiff, avoided eye contact. Mike fidgeted, arms folded tightly across his chest like armor against what he could now sense was an approaching reckoning. Wallace took a single step toward them, and it was the kind of step that cleared out any illusion of control they thought they had. "What happened here?" Wallace asked. The tone was neutral, but dangerously so. Cold, surgical. Each word was measured and deliberate, like rounds chambered into a weapon. Dave stumbled over his answer. He was sleeping on the bench, sir. We asked him to move. He didn't respond, so we had to escalate. Standard protocol." "Escalate," Wallace repeated, almost as if he were trying the word on for size. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Did he pose a threat to you? Was he armed? Violent?" "No, sir, but we thought he might be intoxicated. He didn't respond when we told him to leave," Dave replied, his voice thinner now, as if every syllable cost him confidence. "So, your solution," Wallace said slowly, "was to deploy a stun weapon on a 70-year-old man, a man sitting alone, not shouting, not harassing, not resisting, just resting." He let that hang in the air like a suspended hammer. Neither guard responded. There was nothing to say. Mike cleared his throat as if preparing to speak, then thought better of it. Wallace's eyes didn't waver. "I wonder," he said quietly, "if either of you stopped to consider why a man might not respond right away. Did you think perhaps he was in pain? Did it cross your mind he could have been injured or ill? That he might be carrying shrapnel in his spine? That perhaps, just perhaps, he wasn't ignoring you, but surviving you?" Dave's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came. The crowd that had formed around them was dead silent. Phones were still recording. Eyewitnesses, once indifferent, now hung on every word. The moment had grown too large to ignore. Wallace glanced back at Arthur, who sat motionless, eyes lowered not out of shame but exhaustion. There was something heartbreaking in his stillness, the quiet dignity of someone used to being overlooked. And Wallace saw it for what it was, not weakness, not compliance, but restraint. Incredible, disciplined restraint. Arthur had endured a public attack, had been humiliated, and yet had shown more composure than the men who had assaulted him. Wallace turned again to Dave and Mike. "You didn't ask him his name," he said. "You didn't ask if he needed help. You didn't even ask if he was a veteran. You saw a tired man and decided he wasn't worth the effort of decency." Dave's hands twitched at his sides. "We didn't know who he was," he began, but Wallace raised a single hand, and the words shriveled in his throat. "You didn't care who he was. And there it was, the truth, laid bare in 7 words. Wallace stepped aside and nodded to one of his aides, who had been quietly gathering statements and details from those nearby. She handed over a clipboard with names, timestamps, witness testimonies. There was already a formal record taking shape, and it was becoming very clear that this would not be buried under bureaucracy. Wallace glanced at the list, then back at the crowd. "I will be speaking to your employer," he told the guards, "and I will be speaking to the city about their contract with your firm. There will be inquiries, there will be accountability, I promise you that much." He turned to Arthur once more, kneeling slightly so they could meet at eye level. "Sergeant Major," he said gently, the edge from his voice now replaced with something warmer, more personal. "Do you need medical attention? We can have a medic here in less than 5 minutes, or a vehicle ready to transport you, wherever you'd like to go." Arthur shook his head slowly, his breath still short, his voice low. "No, General. I'm fine. It's not the first time I've been knocked down." He paused, then added, "But it's been a long time since someone helped me stand back up." Wallace gave the faintest smile. "Well then, let's change that." He reached out, not with command but with respect, offering Arthur his hand. It was an old gesture, worn but meaningful, and Arthur accepted it without hesitation. As Wallace helped him to his feet, something remarkable happened. Something not scripted, not ordered. The crowd, slowly and silently, parted. No one said a word. No one had to. They understood they were witnessing a moment that would echo far beyond that patch of concrete. People moved aside not out of fear, but out of reverence. Together, Wallace and Arthur began walking toward the parked SUVs. The aides followed close behind. Wallace spoke quietly as they moved. "We've been looking for you. There's a reunion this weekend. Task Force Omega, outside DC. Some of the others are already there. They've been asking about you. You're missed, Arthur, and you're needed." Arthur said nothing at first. He only nodded, a subtle nod that carried years of weight. Then he glanced sideways at Wallace and asked with the smallest trace of humor, "Still serving coffee as bad as I remember?" Wallace chuckled. "Worse, but we've got real beds now." They approached the lead SUV, its door held open. Wallace gestured toward it. Arthur paused. He turned, just for a second, to look back at the bench, at the place where it all started, the place where he had been treated like a nobody, and he looked past it, at the crowd, at the faces now filled with realization. There was no bitterness in his gaze, just a tired kind of peace. He climbed into the vehicle, the door closed behind him, and the convoy prepared to leave. Dave and Mike were left behind, surrounded by silence and judgment. The park manager, alerted by the commotion, had finally arrived, his face a shade paler with every passing second as he took in the scene, the black SUVs, the federal presence, the simmering tension in the crowd. He opened his mouth to speak to Wallace, to explain, to apologize, but the moment had passed. Nothing he could say would undo what had been done. As the engines rumbled to life and the convoy rolled away, a young woman in the crowd began to clap. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, deliberate gesture of respect. A few others joined, then more. And within seconds, the park echoed, not with noise, but with meaning. Applause, for a man who had sat silently in the shadows, forgotten, until the world remembered who he truly was. Inside the SUV, the world outside felt like a distant memory. The temperature was cool, the leather seats plush but firm, and the interior hummed with a quiet authority. Arthur sat upright, his back still sore, his legs still trembling faintly from the residual effects of the taser. But in his eyes there was a shift. He wasn't sure what to call it yet. It wasn't relief, not quite. It wasn't pride. Maybe it was simply the return of something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition. A sense that someone, somewhere, still remembered what he had done. That all those years hadn't disappeared into the void of civilian life like so many others. Wallace glanced at him from the opposite seat, his demeanor softened now. No longer the general issuing orders in a public park, but an old friend reaching across time. "We've been trying to track you down for weeks," he said. "You fell off the grid, Arthur. VA had your last known address, but nothing recent. Some of the guys were starting to worry you didn't want to be found." Arthur gave a weary smile, eyes fixed out the tinted window. "Wasn't hiding," he murmured. "Just wasn't sure anyone was still looking." "Well, we were. You're still part of us. That never stopped." For a few moments, they drove in silence, the soft hum of tires on asphalt filling the space. Then Wallace reached into his coat pocket and handed Arthur a small velvet-lined case. Arthur opened it slowly. Inside was the same coin, his coin, but now meticulously cleaned, polished to a subtle sheen. The tarnish of time and dirt had been wiped away, and the Omega symbol gleamed softly under the vehicle's ambient lighting. Arthur held it in both hands, staring at it with a kind of reverence. "I thought I'd lost it," he said. "Felt like losing a piece of myself." "You didn't lose it," Wallace replied. "It was taken. There's a difference." The general's voice held a quiet but steady anger when he spoke the last sentence, as if the indignity of what had happened in the park still sat with him like a stone in his chest. "There's already a formal report being filed, not just with the city, with the Secretary of Defense's office. They want to meet with you, offer support, resources, respect. Frankly, I think they just want to stand in front of you and say thank you, face to face." Arthur didn't say anything for a moment. He looked down at the coin again, running a thumb across its edge. "I don't need medals, don't need an apology from suits behind desks. Just want to know the men I served with made it home, that they were remembered, that we mattered." "You do," Wallace said without hesitation. "Every one of you does." As the SUV entered the quiet grounds of a secure guest facility outside the city, reserved for visiting high-ranking military or dignitaries, Arthur saw the flags lining the driveway, the trimmed hedges, the guards at the gate who stood straighter when they saw Wallace's vehicle approaching. The convoy rolled to a stop near the front doors. A staff member in uniform opened Arthur's door and extended a hand to help him out. He took it. The facility wasn't luxurious in the traditional sense. It was dignified. Clean lines, warm lighting, and a quiet atmosphere that radiated respect rather than indulgence. Inside, they brought him to a suite, not a hospital room, not a shelter bed. A suite, a place with soft chairs, framed photos of historic units on the walls, and a neatly folded uniform left in a shadow box display on the dresser. It didn't need to be said, this place was for soldiers, for warriors, for those who had done the impossible and lived to tell no one. After Arthur settled in, Wallace told him more about the reunion. "They've been gathering for 3 days now," he said. "Some of them flew in from across the country. It's not just a social event, it's a kind of closure. You'd be surprised how many of us carry ghosts, and seeing you again, it'll mean more than I can explain." Arthur looked down at his hands, hands that had pulled trigger and tourniquet, written letters he'd never sent, and buried friends whose names were etched only in memory. "I'm not sure what I'll say to them." "Say whatever you want," Wallace answered. "Or say nothing. Just being there is enough." The following day, Arthur arrived at the reunion hall, a modest but elegant venue tucked away on the edge of a wooded property. Rows of chairs had been set up beneath banners bearing insignias long retired from active service. Men stood in clusters, some in crisp suits, others in casual wear, all carrying themselves with the quiet understanding only shared by those who've faced death together. When Arthur stepped into the room, the conversation stopped, heads turned, a moment passed in stunned silence. Then one of the men stepped forward, his face weathered but his eyes instantly lighting with recognition. "Jenkins?" he said, disbelieving. "Arthur Jenkins?" Arthur smiled faintly, still standing. The man walked straight to him and embraced him without hesitation. Another followed, then another. Laughter and tears mingled freely. Old war stories resurfaced, along with jokes that only made sense to those who had been there. For hours they shared memories that had been locked away too long, stories not found in history books but carried like relics in their hearts. Later, in a quiet ceremony, General Wallace addressed the group, acknowledging their years of silence, their sacrifices, and the burden of their shared experience. And when he handed Arthur the polished coin again in front of them all, this time enclosed in a display case etched with his name and service dates, the applause was not polite, it was thunderous. It came from the gut, from the soul, and it was not just for Arthur, but for every forgotten warrior who had ever needed to be remembered. A few days after the reunion, the bench in City Park, once just another spot of chipped paint and forgotten humanity, had changed. A small bronze plaque had been bolted into place at its center. It read, simply, "Reserved in honor of our veterans. Thank you for your service." No names, no ranks, just truth. Beside it, someone, unknown, had left a bouquet of bright, fresh flowers, wrapped in paper with a single line handwritten in shaky ink. "We see you now." And for the first time in many years, Arthur Jenkins wasn't invisible. He was acknowledged, not as a victim, not as a statistic, but as what he had always been. A soldier, a protector, a man who had served in the shadows but would no longer be forgotten.